I dag har vi hatt den første seminaret i serien Naturen og politikken. Senter for bærekraftig arealbruk ved UiB utforsker denne serien den norske implementeringen av den globale naturavtalen. Vi undersøker hvordan denne avtalen egentlig blir satt i arbeid i Norge, og vi ser på det med våre forskjellige faglige briller. Biologisk, geografisk, juridisk, økonomisk osv. osv. Velkommen. It's fantastic to see you all here. People from very many different places. And this whole seminar series started a bit as a chance event. A few weeks ago, some of us were sitting in a seminar room and just discussing this nature deal. And we had such a good discussion about it from all different perspectives, from law and from the humanities and from social sciences and from biology, that we figured we should meet again and talk about this again. And then we thought, why don't we make it a seminar series? And all of a sudden it was born, and within, I think, 24 hours or something, we had signed up seminars until May. So I hope you all will sort of keep with us for that. So I'll talk a little bit about the whole seminar series when I'm through. But my task today is not to present how this nature deal is interacting with nature and to analyze if it will actually save nature or not. I think that will come out of the entire series. But my task today is to give you some kind of a primer, some kind of a short introduction to everything related to nature and nature policy internationally and nationally in half an hour. So I hope you'll stay with me. But the first thing I can say is that I don't know how about you guys, but in my feed there is a lot of nature. There is a lot of talk about nature these days. And for example, this movie, Skal hilse fra naturen, or I don't remember what it's called in English actually, Regards from Nature or something. It's a fantastic movie showing this photographer and how he's during the pandemic he got really sort of sorrowful and worried and started to think about what is happening to nature. And so he decided to travel around Norway and film all the places that he has loved and filmed in his life. And then he talks about it. And if you haven't seen this movie, I would strongly recommend you to see it. And not only me. He also got a prize in France, and this weekend he got 2 prizes in Mexico. So this is a movie that is engaging a lot of people. And he said that it's quite fun to show this movie, especially abroad, because young people come up to him afterwards and they say, you know, these concerns that you are voicing from Norway are also an issue in my country. So there are a lot of people out there worried about nature, thinking about what we need to do to safeguard it. So really nice then that all the countries in the world, or at least 190 of them or so, met up in Cali, in Colombia, just ending last week actually, to have this meeting, COP16, of the Convention on Biodiversity. And COP, if you don't know that, COP means just Conference of the Parties. And so when the Convention of Biodiversity have their COPs, since they have COPs every other year, we are at COP16, whereas the Convention of the Climate Convention have their COP29 starting next week, because they have them every year. And if you can count back, you will see that they started approximately at the same time. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that as well. So I was actually ill during the time when this COP was going on, which was great, because then I could watch slow TV on the United Nations TV channel. It's highly recommended. And so I was watching these meetings. And then you can watch all the negotiations and everything they're talking about and everything that's happening in the room. Quite exciting. And there were some really quite nice deliverables from this COP. For example, they set up a new subsidiary body, a new group of representatives that will represent indigenous peoples from all over the world in these negotiations. So from now on, they don't need to come through their countries. They are actually represented as indigenous peoples. That's kind of cool. They also made some decisions when it comes to nature and climate and alien species. And they made some decisions regarding digital data from nature. So how funding from, or the profit from the digital data should be shared with local communities and nations. So not only the companies, but actually the people who live in the countries also get some of the revenue. So that's kind of cool. But this COP will not be remembered by its successes. It will be remembered by how it ended, because it ended in disaster. in this big chaos. And I was sitting there watching it in real time. When so this is Susanna Mohammed. She is the Minister of Environment from Colombia. So she was the president of COP16, and she was going through these cases, and she was lifting her arm and she would bring them on, and things were going so well. And then there were just two things that they were going to decide towards the end. One of them was a monitoring framework. So how will the countries report on how they deliver on the nature deal? And the second thing was the funding. How will funds be mobilized globally? And those who know anything about global international negotiations at all know that when it comes to reporting and funding, that's when the fighting starts. And so there was no agreement. The whole meeting ended in a chaos, and yeah, there will be a long story about that. I'm not going to go into details about that. But what this means is that actually the meeting didn't even close. So it's formally still open, so it will maybe be the longest COP in history. They will meet next year and hopefully manage to get some agreement on these things. But there are huge conflicts between poor countries in the south, which have a lot of biodiversity, and feel that they need support from rich countries, largely in the north, if they are to support to conserve their biodiversity. And the rich countries in the north feel that if they're going to give money to the poorer countries in the south, then they want good monitoring. They want to know that the money is used for what it's supposed to be used for. So you can see the conflicts going on here, and there's a lot more. So there was a lot happier moments. So this is from COP15, so the previous one, 2 years ago, if you remember. So this was in December 2019. There was a lot happier moments. There's the Chinese president at the time. So this was the Kunming-Montreal meeting. Do you know why it's called the Kunming-Montreal meeting, by the way? It was supposed to be happening in Kunming in China in 2019. Big international meeting, 196 countries in October in 2019. You think it happened? Nope. It got postponed. So it finally happened in 2022, and then they moved it to Montreal because they still couldn't do it in China, but it was called the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, and the Chinese had the presidency. And the Chinese president was actually great. He was doing a really good job at this meeting, and I was there. I'm going to talk a little bit about it later as well. But one of the things that was agreed in this meeting was that, okay, when we meet again in 2 years, then all countries are going to make a plan for how they will contribute to meet the global goals. Now we made an agreement about nature, so everybody needs to make a plan. 2 years seems like a nice timeline, right? So this is the WWF. Their national plans are called MBSAPs. You get very good with these abbreviations when you are in this policy circles. And so this map shows you all the black ones are people that have, or countries that have delivered their plans. The gray ones are countries that have delivered some goals. And what you can immediately see here is some kind of pattern. Like if you look around the tropics, there is not a lot of plans. There is a lot of goals, but not so many plans, because developing these plans are actually quite demanding. But Norway delivered a plan. This is from the WWF NBSAP tracker page. And the colored ones have gotten an assessment by WWF. The ones that are not yet purple haven't. So we're looking very much forward to see what the WWF thinks about the Norwegian plan. But these guys were happy. So this is the Norwegian Minister of Agriculture over there and Environment over here. In September, they delivered this plan. And this plan is what we're going to talk about today. And when it's like a couple of 100-page document, it's written in, departmental language and everything. So when I started reading this, I had a lot of questions about law and about the history of our laws and all these things. So then, of course, I sent an email to my friends, to the Sesam, everybody in Sesam, and said, these everybody mails, you love them, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Somebody wants to talk about this plan. And so we met at this very sort of now famous meeting of this, in some people in Sesam. We didn't take a picture of ourselves, so I asked AI to generate a picture of some scientists discussing nature. Yeah, I don't know. We didn't look exactly like that, but you know, it's close. There's some details that maybe aren't quite, yeah. But the thing was, we met in a seminar room and discussed this for an hour or two, and then we thought it was so interesting that we wanted to meet again. And that's when we said, okay, and then we started to take notes in a joint document. And before we knew it, we had like 2 different op-eds that we had written from this very spontaneous seminar. One of them say how Stortinget can lift the ambitions for Norwegian nature, and the other one talking about where's the action in the action plan anyway. And we actually have another op-ed under production, so this is a very productive seminar that you all are now part of. So we decided to open it up, and so we set up this seminar that you're now in. From nature crisis to solutions, Norway's road to the nature deal. And the idea was that if we make some seminars going forward, and if different people lead the discussions, so we start with different people from different perspectives leading the discussion, but we always talk about how Norway is planning to implement the nature deal and what we can say about it, then that could be quite interesting for everybody. Yeah, and so I said that I will give you a primer to what all of this is about, and so that now we're moving into the primary part of the talk. So what is this nature deal anyway, and what does this? You already know what this abbreviation stands for, actually. Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's the global agreement. And you saw these guys who were very happy about it, but trying to place this on a timeline. We can start sort of the last few decades. Where does this come from? And one of the places that this comes from is the Earth Summit in 1992, which was the first global meeting between nations to make some deals, to make some conventions around nature. And so out of this Earth Summit came the Climate Convention, and the Global and the Biodiversity Convention, and also the Desertification Convention, which is the least famous of the three siblings, perhaps. But before that, there was also some things happening. For example, in 1989, Gro Harlem Brundtland delivered, and her committee delivered the Brundtland Convention, the Brundtland Report, which was a report. The World Sustainable Development, for example, comes out of that report. So that was a huge global effort, and that was also something that led up to and fed into this meeting in 1992. The first climate agreement came already in 1997, and then the Aichi biodiversity target were agreed in 2010. And then the Paris Agreement, which is the legally binding agreement about climate, came in 2015. See, then they were at COP21 already because they were meeting every year. And then there's a lot of other things also, the global goals and all these things, all these kind of things and plans that the countries are agreeing on is also coming sort of around and in addition to this. But it was a bit quiet on the nature front. But all of this stuff is also sort of underpinned by knowledge and science. And so, for example, one very cool thing is this book, The Limits to Growth, which came in 1974, which basically said that unlimited material growth on a limited planet is not possible. I mean, I don't think you need to write a whole book about it, so I assume the book has more in it, but you know. Then in 1990, the first climate change report from the IPCC came about, so the International Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. And then they had regular reports after that. The first report from the Nature Panel, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, didn't come until 2019. And why did it come in 2019? Because it was supposed to feed into the first COP. It was supposed to feed into the nature deal. But of course, they got a lot of time to read that before the deal finally was done in 2022. So that's sort of the science policy interface developing there. So one thing to notice is that the Climate and the Biodiversity Convention started at the same time, but whereas the Climate Convention left the blocks running, biodiversity was sort of trotting around afterwards. But we are getting there. then you can also wonder how much these things actually matter and how big impact they have. But it's important to know that and to remember that we live in the world that we live in. So we don't know the counterfactual stories. So it could have been worse. Of course, it could also have been better. But we are somewhere between the worst case and the best case. And my take on this is that these international collaborations, they're not perfect, but they help. Anyways. But I was talking about these meetings and these COPs, and I want to just give you a little bit of how it feels to be a scientist in those meetings, especially when you haven't been there the first time. So I went to Montreal. I had a window seat, and just flying into to Montreal, you get these land use issues sort of in your face. Nature, agriculture, city, city, city. And in the meeting, there was this enormous conference place with a lot of people, but really all the action happened in rooms like this. So actually in rooms like this. So there were a lot of different rooms where people were sitting and discussing, and all these are representatives from different nations. And they're sitting with text on the screen and discussing text. So these agreements are evolving at these meetings. They're writing them sort of as they sit there and negotiate. And it's really quite fascinating to watch. So this was me and we're allowed in those rooms actually. So this was me and the chair of IPES, and we were sitting on the floor along the edges because there were no chairs for us. But we could sit there and listen to the discussions. Super interesting. And then there was also this big room where everybody met and made the agreements, but usually everything is agreed beforehand. So there is a draft coming into the meeting, and then there is working group, there is the plenary, and then there's working groups, and there's groups under the working groups again. And if everything goes really, really badly, they set down a group called Friends of the Chair. And that's when you know there is trouble. Because those friends, that's friends, yeah. And the way that these targets evolve, so the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Agreement, which I'm going to give you my brief version of it later, but all these targets in these agreements, they evolve in a very real sense. So this is, text with track changes. So they're sitting there and working in track changes on the screen and discussing all these texts as they are emerging. And what I find quite fascinating is that the way it works in this policy world, which is completely different to science, is that everybody has to agree. All the countries have to agree. And so therefore there are, I don't know if you can see it in the back, but it doesn't really matter what it says, but there is a lot of alternative text. So there's these square brackets. So if they agree, it's black text. If they don't agree, they put it in square brackets. And if there's square brackets, there is a discussion. And so there can be, in the beginning, you have the proposed text. Then there is more and more square brackets, and hopefully there's less and less towards the end. So there is this enormous discussion. And coming from science, it's sort of so fascinating to watch this. I'm quite impressed by them actually. They're quite good at disagreeing. We disagree too, but we don't need to agree all the time. But having to agree at the end of the day is really quite hard. So that's fascinating, yeah. So this is one of the targets. This is the pollution target, I believe. That's why it looks like in the middle of the meeting. That's what it looked like in the end. And there was these big discussions. And the Kunming-Montreal Agreement has diplomacy text, and it's not the best, easiest language for everybody to understand. It has 23 goals, 4 overarching goals. It has a lot of other issues, things in it. And so when I came home, the first thing I did was to make a cheat sheet for myself. And so I'm going to run you through the cheat sheet now. So that's one of the things I want you to have with you coming out of here. Just how is this agreement made? And so the way I see it, it has 4 turns. It talks about what we need to conserve. It talks about what we need to avoid. It talks about things that we need to safeguard, and then it talks about action. And the first turn has 4 goals in it. And so here, who here has not heard about protect 30%? Who here has heard about? Exactly. Good. So these 4 first goals, they are about, the 30% goal is in here. So goal number 3 is that we should effectively conserve 30% of our lands and seas. But there are some other goals here as well. I think, for example, the first one is super cool. It says that we should have biodiversity inclusive spatial planning and a near zero loss of nature on all our lands. So that's actually talking about what happens outside the 30%. Then we should effectively restore 30% of degraded nature, which is also a great goal. We know that 70% to 75% of the land areas on Earth are impacted by nature, by people, so there's a lot of areas to restore. We should start restoring them. That's great. And then the fourth one basically says that if we achieve all of this, then we should be able to halt human-induced extinctions and ensure recovery of nature. So that's all good. And we actually had goals like this at least since 1992 and probably before that as well. But those are nice goals. But then the agreement goes further and it says, well, if we are to achieve that, we need to avoid some things. And what we need to avoid are things like unsustainable harvest. We need to avoid or reduce the negative impacts from alien species, pollution, and climate change. Sounds reasonable. But then the framework goes on and it says, well, if people are going to accept to do these things in order to safeguard nature, we probably need to make sure that they have something back. And so there's 5 goals talking about what we need to safeguard. So, for example, we need agriculture, fisheries and forestry. We need food, seems obvious. We also need urban green spaces. People need nature near them. We need to share benefits from genetic resources, and this was actually one of the big successes that I talked about. We were able to make a good agreement about this on the COP16. And then we also need to restore and enhance ecosystem functions and services. So all of these things are things that people need, and things that we need to safeguard. But then the coolest part of the agreement is actually the 10 last goals. And they don't talk about nature at all. They just talk about how to implement this in society. And so goal number 14, for example, the first one here, it says that if we are to achieve this, then we can't isolate nature and just treat nature policy like a separated thing. It needs to be integrated into all policy and all practice. Businesses need to be involved. Consumption needs to be sustainable. We need to reduce food waste. And we need to do something with finance. We need to make sure that we stop subsidizing destruction of nature and start subsidizing maintenance of nature. So, and then a lot of other goals. And so this whole package of 23 goals has 4 overarching goals, and I sort of color-coded them by where they belong on this framework. We need to halt the loss and restore nature. We need to use lands and seas sustainably. We need to share benefits and services, and we need to mobilize the necessary resources. And all these are to be met by 2050. And one of the things that they were discussing a lot during the COP15 when I was there was the numbers and the facts and the dates. Because of course it's much easier. Think about if you want to exercise, for example. If you say, I'll be very fit when I'm 70, that's an easy goal to have. But if I say, okay, and I'm going to exercise every week, it's a little bit more likely that I will reach that goal. And it's the same thing here. So those that are sort of colored in here, they are actually timed. So there is a time set. And then some of them, as you will see, have like the 30% goals have numbers. Those over there, some of them have numbers, but many of them don't have numbers. And there was a lot of negotiations around that. But then you could ask, where does this start? Who wrote the first draft of this thing? And why exactly 30%, for example? And there is where the management starts to intersect with, or where the policy starts to intersect with science. Because the draft from this was written based on that first IPBES report. So all the knowledge that was synthesized in the IPBES report really made it into this draft. Oops. And I want to be here. Yeah. And so does anybody of you remember this sort of 1 million species threatened by extinction? It made the press in 2019. And that came out of this of the first IPBES report. And so, for example, here's the 1 million species threatened by extinction, 72%, or the fall of biomass of wild animals has decreased by 82% on the world. So there are some big numbers that they identified here. But what I want to point out was, if you remember the green and the red things that I showed you before, we were supposed to reduce land use, but also exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. So those things were pinpointed in the agreement because they were identified here as the most important drivers of the changes that we're seeing in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine habitats. So it comes out of here. And the 30% also comes out of science, because what science says is that in order for biodiversity to stop declining, you need approximately 30% of the area or in good ecological condition or in near pristine ecological condition. So this comes out of the science. And IPBES, since they started up, so the big report was in 2019. They did some practicing before that. They wrote some reports in 2016 and 2018 as well. These regional reports, for example. Then they also delivered some reports in 2022. And in 2023, the invasive alien species report came. And then there's a lot of upcoming reports being published now or in the years to come. So something called the nexus, which is the intersection between biodiversity, food and health. And then there is one on transformative change. So how do we transform society? If we need to transform the whole society, how do we actually do that? Then there's a report on business and biodiversity, and then there will be a second global report, which will come out in 2029. And why will it come out in 2029? Because the next global agreement on nature will be in 2030. So it's timed. So we'll see if there is a new pandemic, who knows. But anyway. Yeah, so I was part of writing the Europe report. I was also part of writing this invasive alien species report. And there are a few other people in the room who have also been part of writing some of these reports. So I just wanted also to run you through a bit how we do that, how that process works. Because I talked about how people in the diplomacy, they need to agree. But in science, it's the other way around. If we agree about something, then we're done with that. So what we're interested in is what we don't know and what we don't agree about. But what society needs to know is what we know and what we agree about. So in order to get that knowledge, the common ground, the countries have set up these enormously complex processes. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the way that this works is as follows. And it's kind of like a board game. They drew it like a board game, which I think is kind of cute. So it starts with the countries in the COP that you know now. The COP 15, for example, and the COP 16. They requested some knowledge synthesis on pollution. So there will be a new report on pollution because they requested it. So they request knowledge, and then there is a whole process of finding the right experts to participate in this process. They want them to be representing a lot of different sciences, come from different countries, represent different ethnicities, and so on and so forth. They want good scientists, but they also need to be representative. And then they send the scientists away, and essentially for 2 or 3 years, and say, go and write the report. And then when the report, and here the politicians and the policymakers don't interfere. So the scientists are free to deliver whatever they want, as long as they answered the question that was asked. And then the report goes back to the countries, and then they approve the final assessment. And then it sort of starts to be used and all that, for example, by in making the global agreement or in specifying the global agreement. And so I'm going to use our report as an example. This was us, happily, in 2018. We were supposed to meet once a year, physical meetings all around the world. I was very much looking forward to that. Didn't happen. We had a lot of very nice 1-week online seminars, wonderful. But we ended up writing a report. And one of our graphics is like this. We have several of them, but this is one of the graphics, and I just wanted to show you an example. So this one, we wanted to summarize the impacts that invasive alien species have on nature. And we had endless discussion, like we say, okay, they cause extinctions of plants and animals, there are some economic costs, and there are some consequences for people's lives. So we agreed that we should report on those. But we discussed a lot, should we give numbers? Because giving numbers is really hard and numbers are really rough. but people like numbers. 1 million species, right? We talked a lot about 1 million species. That's a back of the envelope calculation, but it communicates. So we decided to find some numbers. And one of the cool numbers that we found was that if you look at all the species that we know have been driven to extinction during the last decades or by humans, 60% of them, invasive alien species, were part of the cause. That's a lot. So we thought that's a good number to present. And then we did something on economic costs, which are really hard to calculate, as people from NHH can. So we didn't want to focus on the numbers, but we thought the fact that they're multiplied by 4 every decade, that they're increasing very fast, that was an interesting number to report. And then we assessed a lot of different impacts, and we found that all the impacts that we can, or 85% of the impacts were negative. So although people often introduce alien species for a reason, there's a lot of negative impacts. So these were the numbers that we were reporting. And then we had a lot of discussions around, should we show a map? Because some countries might not like to be on the map. What should the examples be? Which countries should they be from? A lot of discussion, because that can be very difficult. And going into our meeting, which I'll tell you about after, we actually had very many versions of this one. Without map, without examples, all these things, in case the countries didn't want it. And during the process, we were a lot of different people. So we were 285 contributing experts, and we assessed a lot of species, and we had 12,000 comments on our report from governments and private persons and everybody. And we wrote 1,400 pages and assessed 30,000 published pieces of literature and so on and so forth. So it was a lot of work. But when all this was finished, then we went back to the governments, because they were to adopt the report. And how that works is that you get into this. We were in Bonn for our report. That's where IPBES meets. And here again is a country with a room with all these nations. And we are sitting on the stage. And the big, thick report, which is like this thick. I should have brought it, I realize. But this thick, that's ours. The scientists write that. But there is a summary for policymakers. And that document is co-written by the scientists and the policymakers. And that sounds like a shady business, doesn't it? But actually, it's surprisingly smooth. And so what happens is that we sit there on stage, the text is on the big screens, and then they are negotiating text, which of course drives us a little bit crazy, as you can see from my facial expression. And so the roles there is that here we have some key messages that we're making. And so the roles there is that they can suggest changes to the text. But we can always say, is this consistent with the data? And that's really important, because what that means is that they can change the text so that it's understandable to policymakers. But they cannot change the text so that it doesn't reflect the science. And so if we say yes, this is consistent, it changes. If we say no, it's not consistent, it doesn't change. So we sit there on stage all the time, and it's really quite demanding, because we have 30,000 references and 1,400 pages, and we need to be able to say there and then if it reflects the science. And so the trick was, of course, social media. We had all our experts sitting in the room in different places, sending messages, page this citation. So the people on stage actually had a big forest of helpers, which was really great. This is how happy we looked at the end when the whole thing was approved. I could also talk a lot about this whole process. It was very interesting. But so this is sort of my primer of how this science policy interface works. And now I'm going to sort of go towards the end by talking a little bit about how this is implemented in Norway, and how I read this report with my Norwegian, with my biologist's eyes. So the first thing, of course, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but one thing that you often hear is that we have so much nature in Norway. If you fly over it, it's all green. So why do we need even stuff like this? Why do we need these kind of things? And of course, last winter, many people were shocked by Oppsynsmannen, I was also a bit shocked by oppsynsmannen because they came to my house. But he really made people aware of how much nature is being lost, how we're building in nature. So 44,000 times we built during the last 5 years, which sounds like a lot, but actually only 1.7% of Norwegian area is built down. So can it be such a big problem? The problem is, or you can look at it from the other perspective and ask Norwegian species, are you okay? And so that's what we do through the red list assessments. And there, the last red list that came out in 2021 found out that almost 5,000 Norwegian species are on the red list, so they are in different categories of threat. 21% of all the species that we know in our country. And actually, this is the global average is something like 25, as you remember. So we're delivering species threats at the global average level, which is quite sobering given we are a huge country with very few people. And you can also calculate this in other ways. And there is a lot, our birds, mammals, plants, whatever, are under quite substantial threat. And the thing that really threatens nature is is area change, so it's land use change. That's the big threat. So this is sort of area change, and this is everything else, all those other drivers that we talked about. And why is it like this? Well, why does our species threaten despite these not very big spatial changes? Well, some species, they need a lot of space. This is Hardangervidda. This is how the reindeer, who is near threatened, how they move on Hardangervidda. And you will notice that they don't move around the edges because that's where we are. So they need a lot of space to live their lives, and they need to be able to move between all these areas. And so although we're not building all over Hardangervidda, the fact that we're there is disturbing them. Other species need their habitats. I don't know what's happening here. Yeah, other species need their habitats. So, for example, we have a lot of hydroelectric power. Green power is great in Norway, but the turbines are a slight challenge to some of our fishes. And many of these turbines were made in a time where the technology and the environmental requirements weren't very, very strict, and so therefore there's a lot of problems there. We also know that nature does more than just protecting species. So I love showing people this figure. So this shows if you take the Earth and sort of unpack it. So you go from 50 degrees south to the tropics to 50 degrees north, and you look at how much carbon is there above ground and below ground along this gradient. And then we live here, and so we see there's a lot of carbon stored at our latitudes. Compare, for example, to the tropics. We have all heard about tropical forests, and they do store a lot of carbon above ground, but the huge carbon stores are found in the north, and they're found below ground. And actually, if you look at this from a Norwegian perspective, we have 7 per mil of the global land area. We store 18 per mil of the global soil carbon, or ecosystem carbon, so almost 3 times are the number that we, almost 3 times as much as we have land area. So we are a superpower when it comes to carbon storage. So Norwegian nature does something good for the world. Norwegian nature also does something good for us. So I was part of Naturrisikoutvalget, where we were assessing nature risks. So what is the risk for us if nature is destroyed? And we were looking at all the different sectors in Norway, and what we found was that our economy and our welfare depends on nature. So these primary industries, obviously, but also all kinds of other things that we do, and also our safety and security as people. But we are harming nature to an extent that this exposes us to some risks. And talking about loss of nature in the risk perspective is actually quite effective, because then we don't need to calculate exactly how much nature we need. Instead, we can think about it as an insurance. So how many of you own your house? A fair number of people. Have you insured it? How many has not insured it? Nobody. How many know that their house will burn? Probably nobody. So we don't know that our house will burn, yet we pay insurance. We can think about nature in the same way. We want nature as a way to safeguard our lives in the future. We don't need to know exactly how much of it we need to take care of. So that's a nice way to think about nature. And nature can also help us mitigate or manage climate risks. So, for example, Flom. I mean, the people who live in Flom, they should have sort of thought about this. Floods is obviously a thing there, but there was this really nice report coming out a couple of years back where they looked at what's the best way to avoid big floods, damaging people and hurting people and damaging property in Flom. And what they found out was safeguarding the ecosystem upstream and then making sure that the river had some leeway to expand was the best, cheapest and most sustainable option. So trying to build all these securities and trying to regulate the river was not the best option, economically or sort of in any other way. Unfortunately, Norwegian nature isn't doing so great. So this was a report from OECD coming in 2022. And they said that, you know, nature is Norway's Achilles heel. You're all very good at electrical cars and stuff. But when it comes to taking care of your nature, not so good. And then I just color-coded this also with the same colors as before, like with the nature goal colors. So they said that the red-listed species are increasing in Norway. You need more protection. They said that impacts from land use change, including housing, cabins, and roads, are increasing. They didn't actually say anything about power, you will notice. They also said you need climate-smart agriculture, and they said that the decision processes in your society do not adequately consider nature, climate, or the environment, which is really interesting because that's those 10 last goals in the nature deal. And so if we take the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework home, then we are a small country and we have a kind of a flat structure in our country. So I sent a message on Facebook to the minister and I asked, do you have anything to say specifically about the nature, how we're implementing the nature deal in Norway, and also what do you think of IPBES anyway? And so he answered, he's on paternity leave and I think he's kind of bored because I got like 10 answers. But one of the things that he says that, you know, the IPBES reports are important. And then he talked about the alien species assessment. So he said they are important, they give us some knowledge. And he also said that the special thing about Norway is that we allow the science policy discussions to be out in the open. The environmental agency are allowed to disagree with the politicians, for example, which is a quite interesting take. And yet the politicians decide, but these disagreements are being made visible. So that's an interesting take actually that I hadn't thought about, but yeah. And these guys, they delivered the report in September, and this thing is actually now in process, which was part of the reason why we had all this discussion in the seminar. So what will happen now? So it was delivered in September. And then this committee of people, they are in the Energy and Environment Committee. And for those of you who are not Norwegian, I think it's kind of fun that this committee in the parliament, they work with oil, energy, rivers, and environmental protection. So that's sort of a catch-all. They have a job. So these are from all the different parties. They sit together in parliament and they get this report and they're supposed to assess it and recommend it to parliament. And so there's a hearing on Tuesday, and who's going to that hearing? Yes, Ragnhild is going to that hearing. So we're also giving some input to that hearing, and then we can say what we mean about the report. And so I have 8 minutes. Yeah, okay. So our discussion time is going a little bit. We're blaming mostly Sammen. Yeah, but we'll see. But anyway, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to tell you how it's structured and what I think about it. And we'll see how long that takes. So it's structured in a way that, it's a couple of 100 pages. And it's structured in a way that first it summarizes the status of Norwegian nature. Then it says something about how we work internationally, and it brags a lot about us supporting tropical forests. Then it goes into a chapter which is really quite interesting, which talks about how can we manage nature for future welfare of people and nature. And that one has 3 different interesting topics. It talks about reporting. It talks about something it calls menus of actions, or menyer av tiltak. It talks about principles for sustainable area management, and then some other things. And then the meat of the report is the last part, which is actually 2/3 of the report, where they go through each of the goals and say, what's the global goal? What's the status in Norway? What will we do? And how will we contribute to reach the global goal? But as for those colored things, the accounting thing is something that the report puts a lot of attention to. And this accounting, it's based on the United Nations system, And how it works is that if you are going to do accounting with nature, then first you need to know how big area do you have of forests or rivers or whatever, wetlands. And then you need to know what's the ecological condition of these areas. The next thing you need to know is what's the value, or what's the ecosystem, what's the value of these ecosystems in terms of the ecosystem values, like for example carbon, or in terms of ecosystem services like carbon storage for us, or in terms of money, how much is it worth. And so there's a lot of science going on, sort of trying to pinpoint and trying to develop methods for this. But they are also very keen that we should start doing this. And part of that is because we actually need to start deliver these accounts on the national scale to the United Nations in 2026. So this is something that is really coming up, and it's important. They put a lot of weight on this, which is good. And it relates to many of the goals. These menus of actions. So the idea there is that they take one ecosystem type and then they look at everything that we're doing with that ecosystem type. And this is just their menu for forests. And I'm not going to go through this, but when I look at this, what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of doing things that we're already doing again. So there's not a lot of new stuff going on here. And some of them is actually just answering to what the Parliament has asked for already. So that's really not new. And so that's quite interesting to see, because forests are really quite debated, and they take forward this one nature type that they want to start with to present these menus of actions. And they sort of deliver more knowledge and the old stuff, which is interesting. And then they have the second big theme is what they call these principles for sustainable area management. And knowing that land use is the big threat to nature, of course, having some principles for this is important. And they talk about things that we need to relate to. So we need to know where we're putting projects. So that's basically the mitigation hierarchy that is already implemented in all decision making. So we're trying to avoid damage, to limit damage, to restore, and to compensate. That's like when the road authorities are making roads, they need to answer to this. They might not be answering very well, but they need to answer. So this is already there. We need to document impacts. We need to prioritize the right things, which sounds good, but actually what they're saying is that we should prioritize energy instead of cabins. But they're not talking about prioritizing nature instead of building, which is interesting. They also say that we should have good spatial planning, the polluter pays principle, and we should have differentiated spatial planning. So basically, this only counts in quite urban areas. Out in the countryside, not so much. But if you look at this, all these principles, at least what you notice is that you probably need those maps, and you need some ways to account for nature, and you need some actions that will enable changes to happen if these principles are to be implemented. And so, as an example of what the text looks like on the invasive alien species, which I know well, it's very nice for me that they are referring to our report, so I feel that we did some useful work. But it's also quite interesting that the national goal that they're formulating is much less ambitious than the global goal. So whatever we're going to achieve on the global scale, Norway, unfortunately, is not in the position to deliver this. And that goes on for very many of the goals. So to wrap up, a few takes that I have on these, on having read this text and having looked at these different perspectives. No, wrong way. So one of them is that when our Prime Minister came out, before the state budget was delivered now this fall, he said that he was going to deliver historic action or in the work towards the loss of nature. I have really had an awakening, he says. And what he delivered was 100 million crowns. That's half a bridge. So, say that you don't understand it without saying that you don't understand it. I feel like that's peak this. Another observation is that the report has quite decent sort of state and problem descriptions. But there is a constant political slant. It's always like, rundt omkring I hele landet, there's a lot of that. So there's a lot of Senterpartiet you can hear. And agriculture is like the hero They have sustainably managed our landscapes for centuries and will continue to do so till kingdom come. It links to very, very many initiatives and plans and documents and reports and so on and so forth. This is useful, and I learned a lot from reading it. These menyer av tiltak, all these actions that they talk about is really just summarizing knowledge. So there's a lot. So as a scientist, I love that they want it to be knowledge-based, but I would like something to happen as well. And these principles, there is nothing very new in them. Of course, if they implement them and if there's actual actions, then it's good to systematize it in this way. But if we're just rehashing the same knowledge, then even we as scientists get a bit tired. The goals are really unambitious. Like, for example, they can't even say that we should minimize loss of nature, and they can't say that municipalities should map their nature. They say could. Another thing is that there are some the things that we have talked about for ages, like, for example, protecting mires, or coordinate some laws, or decoupling the knowledge from the decisions in land use planning, or something like that. And they don't talk about it. So these are things that we have talked about for so long. It would be so good if they just could say we should do this now. Or we shall never do it. But they're just not talking about it. And finally, when you look at all the actions, there is a lot of this knowledge stuff. Very few regulations, and a lot of exemptions, and very, very few economic tools. And I also looked at the description number of pages per goal, and when it comes to the 10 last goals, there's just half as many pages per goal there as in the beginning. And those are the most important ones. Even I, as a biologist, understand that, because that's where the action happens. Right, Ingunn? And so I did some word counts, which I found was quite interesting. So bærekraftig bruk is the most popular of the words that I was looking for. Vern and bevaring are much less popular. Tilskudd, avgitt, regulering, forbud, påbud og plikt. Very little used. Naturregnskap is the most common one of all these. Menyer og prinsipper, which they really try to highlight. Not used so much. So basically, it's an accounting exercise. That's what they're planning for. And it's a bit of a missed opportunity, because if you ask people, this is my dad, by the way, he likes nature, even in a planted forest, because he can find blueberries. But if you ask people, not the easy question, like, do you want more nature, do you want everything free, and so on and so forth. But if you ask them, if you had to choose, would you protect agricultural lands or build? People would protect. Would you protect nature or allow cabins? People would protect. Would you dump mountains in fjords? No thanks. So there's a lot of, if you ask people, they actually want to sacrifice stuff for protecting nature. And so I've given an extremely bad example of how we're supposed to do the seminar series, because we're over time and we're supposed to talk and stuff. I blame someone, but I also thought it was important to run through some of these things, and there is a lot. But what is going to happen going forward is that on the 7th of November, we have the next seminar. No, 7th of November is today, then we have the introduction. On 5th of December, then we have the next seminar, Nature and the Local Society. And I think I saw Eva here. So there are some people here who will actually be presenting that. Then we have Nature and the Law, Nature and History, Nature and the City, maybe Nature and the Water, but I think we also had Nature and Money, and Nature and Language, maybe. So we can fill it with others. But we plan them to be approximately once a month. And how we plan them going forward, now we're all on the same page. So how we plan them going forward is that we'll have approximately half an hour of an introduction, and then some discussions where we can compare different perspectives, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and then speaking of the climate stuff and everything, I think this is just sums very many things up. I think this goes for countries, it goes for climate, it goes for nature. It also goes for municipalities. The neighbor can fix it, and maybe for other things as well. So with that, thank you for your attention and patience.